Hello, and welcome to Grant Writing Tips, video number 6 in the Applied Intercultural Arts Research series. Previous sessions have included an introduction to graduate funding, University of Arizona student supports, searching for academic funding, funding for projects, and help, I need funding fast. This session is providing a foundation for beginning grant writing. So if you are already an expert at grant writing, you may already know everything in this video, but we want to make sure that folks who don't have that kind of experience have a resource for a beginning point. Just to sort of get grounded in grant making world, in a previous video, we've talked about how to begin your search. And then as you find relevant funding opportunities, I really suggest that you keep a running spreadsheet for yourself, or you could just keep those in the AIAR funding opportunity spreadsheet, but somewhere that you can organize information such as who the funder is, what kind of funding you're offering. For example, is that a grant or a fellowship or a job possibility, perhaps? Then amount of funding. So if you know that it's a $50,000 maximum request or it's a $10,000 flat basis award, whatever information you have about the funding amounts. And then I like to keep the organization's mission and or vision somewhere in this spreadsheet so that when I come back to it, I can at a glance know, how does my work fit with what they say they want to do in the world? And then, of course, any information that you know about the schedule. When does the opportunity open? When is the deadline? Are there workshops available? Anything like that you can find so that at a glance, you have all of that information for each potential funder. And then I always suggest that you start a standing file for basic attachments. So many of your applications are going to be asking for the same kind of information. And so just putting all of that in one folder, perhaps on your desktop, is a really important way to keep you from getting later in the application process and realizing that you don't have something. So this way, if you begin by creating that file and checking it against the requirements of the application, if there are things you don't need, you can request that and have that moving while you're working on the grant application. So some of the kinds of things that you might want to collect in this file would be images of your ID. So for example, if you're applying to funding opportunity that requires you to be a resident of a certain state, or if you're an international student and you have to provide information about your visa, for example, especially early in the funding journey, I found it really helpful to pull from my PhD application essays because it made it easy to be able to remind myself how I was talking about what I was hoping to do. And so if you're just starting your funding search and maybe you're working on your first academic fellowship application, having that would be really helpful. Different funders will ask for bio or CV in different formats. So having a couple of those on hand, even if you need to edit them later to conform to the funder application requirements, having those and click away is a great idea. And then many funders will ask for some sort of statement. So it could be a research statement or an artist statement, or you might be asked for a diversity statement at some point. Those kinds of documents, the more that you have to access and draw from, quicker it will go for you later in the process. And then just one last thing to keep in mind before jumping into the grant writing process is that often funders have an online portal or there's some prerequisite that you have to fill. And if you wait until you've already written the application to do those setup steps, you may find that you've run out of time. And so make sure that you take the time to go into the portal, click through any kind of setup or add any information that's required in advance so that you can see that you can be able to submit the application before even beginning to write it. So when you're looking at a grant application, there are several components that I want to make sure you're thinking about. First is applicant eligibility. This is the most critical thing. If you are not eligible for the particular type of grant that's being offered, it's a total waste of everyone's time. And unfortunately, people often miss this step of, am I eligible? And so really going through those parameters with a fine-tooth comb is an important first step. Now, you may see that there's a grant that you're interested in that can only be awarded to organizations. If it's truly a good fit, and depending upon the type of work that you do, you might consider going to an organization in Tucson that would have an interest in pursuing that grant opportunity with you. And even if they're not able to, for some reason, perhaps they're not a 501c3 or there's something about their status that would prevent them from being eligible, there's often the option of a fiscal sponsor and having another nonprofit sponsor this grant application. So look very closely at applicant eligibility and also have an open mind to how you might be creative about getting eligible if you're not. Then you want to look to see if the thing that you want to apply for is even eligible. Sometimes that will look like we only fund projects in these 3 states. Sometimes it will mean we only fund the arts every other year. So you really want to look at what types of projects are eligible. Sometimes there are budget requirements. Sometimes there are requirements about having public opportunities or all sorts of things that could make a really good idea ineligible for any given grant opportunity. Then you want to look for what's called the funding performance period. It can be called other things as well, but look to see when do the projects have to occur. Sometimes that's within a calendar year. Sometimes that's within the academic year. So you might be accepting a fellowship that starts in August and ends in May. And sometimes it's based on the funder's fiscal year. So if you are working on an application for a project in March, but the funding period begins on their fiscal year, June 1st, then no matter how good your project is, if it's not in that window, it won't be funded. Then I would suggest starting to look at the application itself. What kinds of questions are they asking? And this is going to determine how much effort is required on your part. There are some funding opportunities that will just ask very generic questions, like, please describe the project for which you're applying, or questions about your background or identity, or some things like that, that could even just be a drop down. But where there are more specific questions, it's really helpful to copy those so that you can use those when you're crafting your application. And what I mean by that is, if the question says, define the goals of your project, one grant writing trick is to answer the question using the question. So in that case, you might say, the goals of this project are to blah, blah, blah. That way, it makes it very easy for the people who are scoring these applications to see the direct answer to the question. And so any hints that you might be able to draw based on the types of questions they're asking is really helpful. And then looking at existing copy, whether that's within the grant program itself or on the grants page on the funder's website or in other places, anything that's been written about what the funder hopes to accomplish with this funding opportunity or in the world in terms of their mission, then that is going to also be fuel for your application. So you'll want to go out and find that. Nearly every grant application has some kind of narrative, and that just means the section where you give a general description of your project or intended use of the funds. Those you'll want to think about: who, what, where, when, why, how many, how much, how often, all of those kinds of things. So what project narrative that is both specific and succinct might say something like, for my project, I intend to offer 9 after-school workshops for students age 12 to 18. They will be 90 minutes each, and each one will focus on a different skill related to creative writing about the environment. And we will invite professors from the University of Arizona's poetry department to teach these workshops, so you're providing that level of information without a lot of adjectives and descriptors in between. Then thinking about attachments. So there are two kinds of attachments. There are like regulatory and compliance attachments. So they may be asking for the 501c3 letter of the organization that you might be working with, or they might ask for your driver's license or passport or that type of thing. If it's a need-based opportunity, they may ask for last year's tax return, any of those kinds of attachments that demonstrate that you are eligible. And then the second category of attachments are supplementary materials. So how can you bolster your application? And you'll want to think about letters of recommendation, as well as work samples. Like, have you done other things related to the project that you're requesting funding for that might be relevant here? And then the last major component of most grant applications is a budget. In that, again, you want to be very specific. 3 copies of XYZ software at 106 hours of primary investigators' time for preparation and analysis, really providing an in-depth quantity, item, and then subtotal for each and everything that you might reasonably include in your budget. Are you providing snacks for students? Are you providing transportation? Are you required to have insurance for your project? So these are all things that you want to think about as you're putting together your grant application. I mentioned earlier pulling copy from your funder's website. That's part of this copy and paste dump that I do that I find really helpful. So some of the kinds of things that I try to put in this document are at the very top: what is the deadline? Information about funder mission vision, that particular grant's goals or purpose. So if a funder says, with these dollars, we seek to provide additional support for underrepresented scholars in the humanities, for example, that kind of language is really helpful because it has to be the primary thing you keep in mind as you draft your application. And then funders will call the policy document about their funding opportunity different things depending on whether they're a foundation or government. But generally, these are called guidelines. Sometimes you'll see something like notice of funding availability or request for applications. This is the kind of language that says, here are the nuts and bolts of what this grant opportunity is about. Pull that, dump that into your document. Then grab those application questions that we talked about. That's going to tell you exactly what you need to. And if there are questions that you don't have a lot of response for, one trick is to go back and think about what other things you need to be able to address that they haven't even asked you about. And so you briefly respond to the actual question, and then you use that as an opportunity to pivot if needed. This is a way of starting to see what information are they asking for, what information do I need to find a way to work in. Then there are the required attachments. I talked about those a moment ago. Another thing that you may find, depending upon the funder, is by what criteria will they be scoring applications? Many funders do not publish this, and many funders do. So if you see that they're going to score a total of 10 points based on applicant identity, and they're going to score 20 points based on alignment with funder goals, that tells you two things. First of all, you need to be addressing those topics. And second of all, you need to put twice as much effort into the second topic because it's twice as many points. Keeping those criteria front of mind will help you prioritize your workflow. So in terms of writing, there's a rule of thumb that I found it helpful as a starting place. Figure out how long you have until the deadline. and then subtract 2 days for contingency. That means that ideally you are submitting your application before the deadline, but if something happens, maybe your letter of recommendation is delayed coming back from your advisor, you have another day or two. And then of the remaining days, allot approximately 20% of your time for planning and setup that we talked about in those last slides, 40% for actually drafting the content of the application, 30% for revision and review, and we'll talk more about that review process in a moment. Then make sure to leave at least 10% for approvals and contingency. And what approvals means there is, especially if you're working in partnership with an organization, they're likely going to want to approve the application before it gets submitted. So you need to make sure that you allot sufficient amount of time for all of that to be able to submit a strong application. Then from there, the next step would be to create a project outline. Now, hopefully you have already thought about what this project is, or you've met with your partners, but now thinking about that concept and putting it within the shape that the funder is asking for. So going from whatever you've already created to really being clear and specific about who the project is for, what it is, when it happens, where it happens, why it's important, how many people are going to benefit, how much is it going to cost, all of those kinds of things in a succinct narrative. And then go back to any materials that the funder might have made available. Sometimes there are technical assistance handouts like a one-pager, or they may have even offered workshops. And even if you miss the opportunity to attend the workshop, sometimes those are available recorded on their website, or you can request them. Then thinking about external content. And again, all of this is before you've even written anything other than your brief outline. So this is anything that you need to get that you can't control. If there are letters of recommendation that you need from your advisor, or if you need to create a memorandum of understanding with your organizational partner, or you need to get bios from artists who you're bringing in for this project, any of that kind of stuff, so that they can be working on that while you are actually drafting the application. And then collect internal content before you start that draft, so that anything that you thought you had or thought you knew where it was, if you couldn't find it, or if it finds out that you need longer to prepare that, you then have that time on the front end. Then that's when you start drafting the application itself and responding to the application questions. Just a few other tips. I really suggest creating a calendar of whatever format works well for you. If it's just a list on a whiteboard, if it's post-it notes on a bulletin board, if you create it as reminders in your phone, because so often we see grant opportunities that could be a really great fit, and then we forget about them because they aren't open at the time. So setting a way to track what those grant opportunities are and when they're available is really useful. I mentioned earlier that review and revision process. One thing that's really critical is always getting somebody who may not know much about your work, or perhaps even your field, to review your application. You want to know what things don't make sense to jargon, either within the context of the field or academia, because you need to make sure that you're speaking in the language of the funder. A piece of advice that I found really helpful from a former colleague is that you should be able to hand a finished grant application to someone else, and within reason, they should be able to go and execute the project. So asking the person who you're getting to review your application, hey, if you needed to go do this project, what questions do you have? What things have not been addressed? Some funders require you to call ahead to discuss your application before submitting an application. Other funders explicitly do not allow that. And so checking out their website to find out whether it's appropriate for you to call and speak with a staff member to talk about your project or your proposed application and make sure it's a good fit. or asking questions about how best to position your application for success. Especially if you have one of those calls with staff, it's really helpful to ask for samples of previous successful applications. Some funders also offer this on their website, but being able to see what kinds of things have been funded before is really helpful. And then finally, there's a whole series of workshops available through the Graduate College on grant writing for academic success. Thanks so much for your time and attention. My name is Benjamin Douglas. I'm currently a PhD student in Applied Intercultural Arts Research, and I really hope that these have been helpful. Feel free to reach out if you have any questions or need additional support.